Hi everyone, Joe March here, also known as Sorcerer, and as stated in my prior two videos, I don't do much magic anymore, and most of my practices revolve around meditation and shamanic journey work to improve the self. So some of you might be asking, what super occulty thing is it then that you're always talking to other occultists about when you're hanging out with other occultists and stuff? Because obviously, based on stories I've told, I hang out with these people, we talk about a bunch of crazy shit. What's the occulty thing that I'm into that we haven't covered yet? That's today's topic. We're talking about entities. More specifically, we're talking about what people consider entities that they interact with through occult practices. I'm going to specify that for a reason that'll make sense later. So as always, let's start with what they say. We're going to give some traditional definitions of these various entities so that it makes more sense. Now, I'm starting out with the all or the source, and I know that's not technically an entity, but I feel like I need to cover it here in order for us to understand some things down the line. This is a concept that exists across numerous religions, including Hermeticism. The idea that there was at one point a source within which all existed, and then from that source, everything that is came to be. You can even find a version of this in science with the Big Bang, that there was this original source from which all things sprang. This idea is echoed across different cultures, across different religions, especially in religions where there's multiple gods. Oftentimes there's an initial something that is everything from which the original first gods spring. Similar to that is the concept of the all, which in some cases is the source, but after having expanded, and in other cases is just something that always was, depending on the religion. But the idea of the all is that everything that exists, whether it be this world, this universe, the multiverse, if that's a thing, everything that exists is the all, this one thing. And you are a part of it. Now this again is scientific. We live within everything else in this existence. And without everything else, we couldn't exist. It's our habitat. We can't go without air, without pressure, the wrong pressure. We can't be on other planets without special equipment. That equipment comes from us making it from stuff that is here in the all. The all has to be in order for you to be, and you are a part of that all. The idea being that every living thing, every inert thing, everything is part of this one all. And if you go spiritually on it, the views there are that the spirit within everything is that spirit of the all. It is just this one thing existing as all of us, that you could say that we are the universe incarnated in an individual form. This idea is big in Hermeticism, although they think they call it the one mind or the one. They view all of reality as thought. That's not necessarily where I go with it, but the idea stands. You see this in a lot of different philosophies, a lot of different religions. So you have the source from which all things sprung, and the all, which is all things. And for some of us, the all is like God. So instead of having God as an individual entity figurehead who's representing like divine justice or something like that, you have everything in nature. All of this stuff, when combined together, is God, and thus you are a piece of God, or a son or daughter of God, that exists within God. And when you die, you still are part of God. Your body goes back to the soil, your ashes are spread to the wind, whatever it be, you are still there, you're just maybe not in the same form you were. This form of death is viewed as transformation. Some people even go as far as to say that if there is a soul or consciousness, the consciousness returns to the all and becomes part of everything once again. Others believe that the soul still exists as its own thing and will reincarnate. It will be given a new form within the all. And all of these things are potentially possible, but I've never died, so I don't actually know. The importance of both these concepts is primarily in that most religions that involve multiple deities start with some singular being that either creates and spawns forth the first gods or divides itself into those gods. And so this concept is a very old concept. It still holds up today. Again, scientifically, if you look at everything around us is part of us, like we are stardust that's been reformed into other things. it still holds up even scientifically. So from the all, we get deities, gods, beings that are considered greater than humans, these representations often of forces. This is the god of this or the god of that. There's a couple different ways to view this. Traditionally, sometimes some cultures viewed these as actual entities, spiritual beings which could be communed with. Others saw them as representations of the forces themselves. The actual thunder in the sky was Thor, for example. But the deities are a way to personify these forces so that you can talk about them, so that you can analyze them, so that you can break them down. Additionally, deities are worshipped. People say, I relate to this particular deity or these particular deities. They stand for what I stand for. I have this connection. I worship them. Or in the past, it might have been the tribe's deity or the city's deity or the main deity of the religion. There's a deity with which you have a connection, through which you're able to do prayer, which is a form of magic by asking the deity in order to intercede on your behalf. Next, we have angels and demons. This is controversial because it really depends on your religion. If we go back to ancient Mesopotamian era, angels and demons are the same thing. They're mostly all just called demons. They are the subcategory of beings that worked under the deities. The deities don't always go to you to do something. They might send an angel or send a demon or what have you. The difference between whether it was called an angel or demon is often based on where it came from. Did it come from the high heavens or did it come from the underworld? And in that day, everyone who died went to the underworld no matter who you were. And then down there they divvied you up. That's how it was in ancient Greece also. The underworlds of the past was where all the dead went. It's ruled over by a class of deities who are considered the dead deities. Their angels are called demons. The deities of the heavens have their own demons, but they're called angels. That's pretty much how it used to work. Now, in a lot of religions nowadays, demons are looked at as nefarious, as the darker aspects of humanity. Like if I was to say, oh man, I've got some inner demons, I'm not saying I've got some inner good stuff. So we look at demons as being this negative aspect of a force, and angels as being this positive aspect of a force. We look at demons as being somewhat chaotic and angels as being somewhat ordered. It's almost like you're taking what that deity represented and splitting it into positive and negative aspects with more defined, smaller, specific pieces of that force. Then we have folk spirits and fairies. So these are the folk tales of these creatures, monsters sometimes wilderness spirits, sometimes they're positive, sometimes they're negative. These other than human spirits that exist on the world with you. That was the idea behind folk spirits, fairies, etc. Next, you have ancestors, this worship of your ancestors from the past. In some beliefs, these are your literal ancestors, like your grandparents and stuff like that. In some beliefs, these are your past incarnations, but these are usually more like guides that you can reach out to in an altered state in order to speak to them and learn things. Then you have true nature spirits. This is more of an animism thing. In animism, everything that exists has its own spirit. So instead of just saying there's the all spirit, which is in everything, you would say, like, I have a spirit, you have a spirit, that rock has a spirit, this laptop has a spirit, this microphone has a spirit. All these things have a spirit, and you can interact with those spirits individually. Nature, more specifically, was often used for this, where you might say, this particular hill has its own spirit, this particular valley has its own spirit. Nature spirits. And then lastly, we got ghosts. And ghosts are going to fall into two categories here. One is ghosts where we talk to ghosts. Like, if I have a dream, and in my dream, my dead mother shows up to me and talks to me, I might wake up and be like, oh, I talked to the ghost of my mother. That falls in line with all these other things we're talking about here, where like a priest's person or a magic user or whatever you want to call yourself, a sorcerer, calls upon these entities to speak to them. That, in that connotation, ghost can fall in here. But the type of ghost we're not talking about is weird paranormal events people see. So if I go out somewhere and then somebody snaps a picture and randomly there's like a little kid in the picture nobody saw and we're like, what the fuck is that? That is not the type of ghost experience we're talking about here. I don't know nothing about none of that. I'm not a ghost hunter. I don't talk to a spirit box. I don't do any of that stuff. In fact, my personal belief on that is I think most of that is either accidents of film or hoaxes, but I'm not here to discredit something that I didn't study. That form of like ghosts, poltergeist activity, stuff like that, not what I'm talking about with entities. If you were like, oh man, we're getting into entities, we're going to hear about like possessions and demonic sounds and what, that's not this. We're talking about when people pray to these entities, when people give offerings to these entities, when people try to commune with these entities while in an altered state. That's what we're talking about today. So what do people say that you're supposed to do in order to contact them? What's the normal ideas here? Altars. Some people will have an altar, and on the altar they'll have an effigy or a statue that resembles the deity or entity that they're working with. And they can also put offerings up on the altar. Now, offerings themselves is their own category. Offerings can be food, they can be drink, they can be items that you think would be enjoyed by the entity. They can be cigars, cigarettes. People have given offerings of all kinds. The idea being that you're giving up the thing that you would care about in exchange for the work that is to be done by the entity. So for some people, it's as simple as to say, we have an altar, you put an offering on the altar, you have the effigy of who you wish to speak to, you do a prayer to that entity, and you're done. That's pretty common. And honestly, I don't see how that's much different than any of these more formal versions. But we'll talk about them anyway. So evocation, classically, what is that? Evocation is when you conjure up an entity into the room with you in order to ask it to do something for you and then send it out to task. Now, I believe that this is just another version of the same magic practices that we talked about in the last video. So just like with traditional magic and spellcasting, you first decide on an intent or desired outcome, you then enter into the trance state, then while in trance, you push your will into something that represents calling forth that entity in order to do your will, and lastly, you let your desire go out into the universe. You can see these are the exact same steps as magic and spellcasting. For most people, step 3, where they are calling on an entity, involves finding a sigil that represents that entity, staring into the sigil in such a way that it starts to vibrate and glow within their mind, and then calling forth the entity, calling for it to come, calling for it to come, calling for it to come, until you start to feel heat and pressure and things like that in the room that tell you that the environment around you feels different. Then you make your request, then you tell it goodbye and let it go. Now, while those are the practical evocation steps that are outlined by a lot of magicians, you can see how this isn't that different from a prayer. You decide on something that you want to pray about, you enter into a state, you make your prayer while giving an offering to the specific entity and staring at the statue, and you let that desire go. Same steps. Invocation, on the other hand, is where it gets more interesting, because invocation is calling an entity into yourself. This is when you're inviting something to enter your body. Ooh, ah, 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 ah. It's still basically the same steps, but instead of staring at something or giving an offering, the offering is entrance into the self, and as a result, you are having an experience as if you are in part the entity, and the entity is having experience as if it is in part you. So now we're done with the whole what they say portion, and I can say, how do I contact these entities? Haha, here we go. And we talked about this already. It's through shamanic journeying. Now I'm leaving these 4 steps on the screen because you're going to see it's still not that different. First, I'm going to decide on which entity I want to speak to and about what. Then I'm going to enter into the trance state on my way to entering into that shamanic journey state, like we talked about in my other video. While I'm in trance, I enter the shamanic journey state, and I keep who I'm trying to talk to and what I want to talk about in mind until I actually start to have that conversation, and then I just focus on keeping myself in that conversation and allowing everything to form as it may and not interfering with it with my mind. And then I say goodbye, I'm respectful, and I leave. It's the same 4 steps. You're going to see this with everything in these kind of like magic-y occult stuff. Why do I consider this different than regular magic? I think whenever you add the journeying aspect, when you add a communication aspect and you're communicating with an entity, this becomes far more interesting to me. Unlike in the evocation method that we talked about a moment ago, you notice I'm not saying that my intent is to ask for this entity to do something. I'm usually more interested in gaining something as a result of speaking to the entity, and in fact, it usually turns into something more akin to invocation, where, as a result of talking to the entity, I take a small bit of the entity's personality into myself, and thus find within myself changes that align me more with the personality of that entity. What the fuck does any of that mean? So here we'll get into what I believe, and it's gonna be controversial to some people, not to other people. I believe that when you do this, you are actually talking to your own subconscious. And these beings represent different aspects of reality as understood by your subconscious. Once again, you, in my opinion, are not talking to an external entity. You are talking to your subconscious self. And the being that you choose to speak to represents a portion of what that subconscious self believes the universe is like. So if I want to talk to the god of war, I'm talking to my subconscious, but through the lens of its most war-like understandings of this reality. It isn't necessarily that you're talking to yourself. It isn't that the subconscious is taking on its most warlike aspects. It's showing you what your deepest unknown self believes about that concept in the outer world, outside of you. It may be showing you a fear that you have. It may be showing you problems with yourself. It may be showing you something you need, some aspect of the self that you have not nurtured. But this is why, to me, entities, as we listed them, aside from paranormal experiences, are more about a psychological understanding of the self. Now, before people go, oh, it's all in your head, what? I believe the subconscious is more than what most people think. To me, the subconscious seems, based on these practices and how I've done it, to be connected to the all in some way. Now we've come back around to why we needed to describe the all earlier. It seems that when you interact with the subconscious and make changes to it or gain knowledge from it or ask something of it, it has some deeper connection to everything else that allows shit to happen that you just can't do if you don't do it through these methods. Does that mean that you're actually sending energy out and stuff like that? I don't think so, but I understand why that terminology is used because it's easier to understand and envision than just saying there's this formless connection to the universe, basically. Now, for me personally, I view the all as God. I'm one of those people. It's like there's God out there, but instead of being able to just kind of interact with God like a person, we interact with it through our subconscious. Our subconscious can personify it like a person, and we can speak to it, and then therefore through it speak to God, because it is our God representation within. Some people might call that the holy guardian angel or the higher self. But I don't see the greater God being as being conscious in the same way we're conscious. I don't see it as being something that we could fully grasp if it is conscious in the way that we are conscious. It would be beyond us to a point where it needs to work through this intermediary self, this part of us that's more like it, in order for us to communicate. Now, do I have proof that I'm actually connected to the cosmos whenever I do this, and that I'm not just interacting with my own subconscious self and changing my own internal brain working? No, I don't. But I'm not sure it makes that big of a difference, because the subconscious is where we store our hidden understandings of everything. It's where we visualize what we believe the all around us is. And so when we're talking to it, we're talking to our representation of that. If we find new things and change our ideas about what that is, our entire subconscious changes, because the subconscious is not just a human. It's not just a being like us. It's everything that we believe. It's everything that deep down inside we think. So to interact with that is a big deal. And if you do manage to personify the subconscious, which is what I believe happens when you start doing long-term deity work and long-term shamanic journey, and you start to get to know yourself, it's like meeting a person you didn't know. It's crazy how much that person is not who you think you are. But the more interactions you have, the more the two become one, and the less like a stranger it feels, the more like you're uncovering and unwrapping a truth about yourself you seem to come to. So that's what I do. That's the occult stuff I'm into. Is it woo-woo? Maybe. I mean, you guys be the judge. But that's the stuff that I get all into. So when we talked about the other subjects, I feel like they were needed to explain this subject, and I feel like they are part of what I do, but this is really what I'm into. People may say, hey, if you're just talking to your own subconscious mind and your subconscious is a representation of the all, then why personify it at all? Again, I believe that there's value in talking to the pieces. So yes, I want to be connected to the all. I want to be more in touch with my own subconscious self, but what if there's a part of that I don't understand so well? Like, I'm getting to know my subconscious, but there's this part of this darkness in here that I don't usually let to the surface, but I want to examine that more. I don't need to talk to all the pieces. I need to examine that piece. So if I can find a representative of this pocket in order to speak to, then I can get to know this thing that was hidden to me before. And I believe this is why a lot of different systems will also have gods related to planets, related to different personality aspects. Well, let's say first you talk to a representative of Mercury, and that's going to explain thought and communication. Then you speak to a representative of, say, Mars, and that's going to explain your more warlike nature. What this is doing is peeling apart the different parts of you in a system that's worked for other people, so you can learn these different aspects. And when you're first doing it, you're not going to know that it's you, unless, the secret's spoiled like what I'm doing. But you're going to think you're talking to separate entities about this stuff. But what happens is you do it again and again, and you start to find the patterns, and you start to find the versions of these that work, and you start to have experiences with these things that other people don't, where you're like, this is my unique instance of this entity, and then you start to blur together, and then you start to understand that they're all just one subconscious you, and then you start to understand that that subconscious you is not a being, but is everything else. And then you find your connection to the all, which is what people talk about as being enlightened, where you no longer see yourself as just a human being, but you actually recognize a connection. We'll just put it that way. I feel like I was like spiraling up in my own shit there, and then my brain just went off into the actual thing that I was trying to explain, like what you recognize, but I don't have words for it. So some people want to use that connection in order to cause things to happen here. That would be people who are heavy into what I consider magic. Some people just want that connection. That's what I'm like. That's what I mean when I say I don't use magic anymore. But how much can you actually do with that? Again, I don't know, because it's not my goal to change stuff through that. It's my goal to change the self, to have a stronger commune with this thing that I believe to be God. It's religious for me. It's spiritual for me. Now, anyone who follows the old channel knows that I used to believe in these deities, as separate entities, as things I was talking to, and it is over time that I came to view them in this way. So if you're someone who views them that way, I don't find it to be a problem at all, even if you always view it that way. I don't feel like it's necessary to understand this underlying thing in order to still gain value from those practices. That said, like I've said with every other trance state thing, be careful not to make it up yourself. I know you're talking to yourself and your subconscious, but you want to hear what the subconscious is displaying to you. You don't want to just have your conscious chatter with itself. You don't want to go, I want this entity to say this to me, so I'm going to go and say the entity said this to me. That's not a good way to do this. You're not going to learn anything. It doesn't hurt you. It's like having a daydream imagining shit. But if you're really trying to delve into who you are and learn things that were hidden, were occult, then you need to do it through the steps. Dive in, let whatever you see be what it is, take it in, and then allow that change to just happen on its own. You don't even necessarily have to understand what you see on a journey in order for it to change you. You just need to go through the experience. Now let's talk about long-term relationships with entities, because as everyone knows, I talk a lot about Tiamat all the time. And that's because whenever we start talking about them as entities, Tiamat is the one I worked with the longest. But Tiamat is the one that over time revealed itself to really be the All, although that was difficult for me because Tiamat in the ancient lore is in fact the actual world upon which we tread. So for a while there's that question, like, are they all the All and Tiamat's just revealing this, or is Tiamat the All because Tiamat is literally the All? I don't, it gets complicated. Anyway, I've had what I would say 5 different entities that I'm dealing with as long-term experiences. And to me, a long-term experience is when you don't just call up an entity to see them and ask a question and then leave. It's when you spend multiple months where when you go into your journey or you do evocation or whatever your method, you work with them. Or it's one that you keep coming back to, where you build a rapport where it feels like someone you know as opposed to like some concept. What's the value of this? The longer you work with a certain entity, the more their traits will merge with yours. In fact, some entities will even go so far as to ask you to merge with them, which means have them permanently be a part of your personality. If you believe they're actual entities, then you may want to think of it from that point of view. If you're like me, it's still something you got to consider because you're taking these aspects of yourself and putting them in what you think of as the core self instead of as just elements of existence around you. You are starting to exemplify them. You're starting to pull them in. If that seems like a beneficial thing, then you can go for it. Like with all these other trance things, be careful not to fuck yourself up. So for me, the entities I had experiences with were Ishtar first, and you can see her symbol here. Oh, look at that. I still basically use this symbol. The Morrigan second. She helped me through a bunch of shadow work. There's tons of videos on that on my old stuff. Tiamat third and for the longest, and it was through Tiamat that I learned that the other 2 and Tiamat were all one thing working with me, one subconscious self that I later started calling the teacher, and now look at as the All, which is number 4. And while the All is the primary thing I work with, I have just now started to accept that while I can embrace this connection to the All, I can also work with deities within it, therefore learning more about specific aspects of it. And I have just started working with Loki on a fairly constant basis. I didn't pick Loki. I'm not usually a Norse person. The All picked Loki, but the All is my subconscious, so I picked Loki. You get it. So Loki is mercurial. I'm going to learn more about communication. I'm going to learn more about thought. And hey, look, once I started working with Loki, within a week, I started this video series. So go figure that. Also, Loki is a shapeshifter. Loki can adapt and change as needed. Loki is a transforming entity. And as you can see in this whole list, all of them are transforming entities. All of them are like death, chaos, etc., which in the old occult way of looking at it did not mean negative or bad, but rather meant the cycle of transformation. Birth, death, rebirth, death, rebirth, death, rebirth. Creativity, creation, destruction, creation, destruction. These cycles are a big part of my own understanding of the grander everything and the personality of what I would call God. So unlike the Christian God who has rules and is an ordered-based being, my version of the All and understanding of that came through my work with Tiamat, who is the primordial essence of chaos from the Mesopotamian time period. So what I think of as God and what other people think of as God, wildly different types of beings. But you can think of what I believe as something more akin to someone who follows nature. Nature is both beautiful and nourishing to us, like a mother, and is wild and dangerous to us, like a predator, at the same time. That is the All. That is the reality we actually live in. That's God. So if this wasn't controversial enough for you, then I'm sorry. That's as good as I can go. This is all the things. Now, what am I going to talk about next time? I don't know, because that basically covered all of my stuff that I work on now. So maybe I'll retread some of the old stuff and what I think about it now, or maybe I'll go into some other topics now, or maybe I'll cover some deities like I used to do back in the day and what their correspondences are for people who do want to journey and talk to different parts of themselves / the All. But until next time, safe travels.